staff lawyer. Sorry, one of the co-directors and staff lawyers at AEL Advocacy. I'm based in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And I'm pleased to be joined today by Berkeley, AEL Advocacy's other co-director and staff lawyer. So I just have a few housekeeping items to go over before we get started today. First, we have set this up as a Zoom meeting, which means you do have control over your camera and mic. However, we do ask that you please keep yourselves muted to limit any background noise until we get to the Q&A portion of the workshop at the end. And second, we are recording this session for those who can't join us live, and it will be posted on our website along with the slides and an information sheet that includes some key information and links from this presentation. So please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box, let us know where you're from, and throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, you can put those in the chat box as well. So in terms of a brief agenda for today's webinar, we're going to start by telling you a little bit about who we are at AEL Advocacy. Then we'll provide an overview of Ontario's Ag-Gag laws, specifically what they do and where they apply. Next, we'll provide some information about what to do if you find yourself in trouble and highlight some effective and legal advocating ideas in light of this new legal regime. And then finally, before we jump into a brief Q&A session, we'll provide a little bit of an update about the ongoing legal challenge of these laws by animal justice. So before we really get into the substance of the presentation, I just want to start by telling you a little bit about who we are. So AEL Advocacy was founded at the end of 2021, and we are Canada's first intersectional animal and environmental law organization. We operate remotely out of Ontario, and as a not-for-profit, we care a lot about ensuring access to justice in the areas of animal and environmental law. So our mandate is really to represent low-income individuals and organizations working to protect animals and the environments where they live, and to provide free legal education for the public, like this session tonight. So we invite you to browse our website and subscribe to our newsletter and social media to stay up to date on our work, including future webinars. And you can see our website and social media handle at the bottom of the slide here. So please note that the information in this presentation is not intended to be legal advice, but rather a general overview of the laws in Ontario. Please do consult a lawyer directly to discuss your specific situation before engaging in any advocacy or protests if you have concerns. So with that, I'll pass it over to Kira for the next part of our presentation.
So while many of you are well-seasoned advocates and likely very familiar with Ag-Gag laws, I'll start off by first discussing exactly what Ag-Gag laws are generally for those potentially less familiar with them. So the term Ag-Gag is short for agricultural gag, and they are generally meant to silence whistleblowers, activists, and others who try to expose animal abuse on farms. These laws rose to popularity in the United States in the 1990s. The influx of these laws has generally coincided with increased media attention surrounding farming practices exposed by undercover investigations. So in the United States, Ag-Gag laws have generally fallen into three categories. First, agricultural interference laws, which generally prohibit the recording of videos or photos in agricultural facilities without the owner's consent. Second, agricultural fraud laws, which make it a crime to gain access to an agricultural facility under false pretenses. And third, the rapid reporting laws, which require reporting of animal abuse with as little as 24 hours. So this effectively means that an investigator who observes a single act of abuse must report it immediately before they can establish patterns of abuse or systematic failings on the part of the industry. And up until 2019, there were no Ag-Gag laws in Canada. However, some form of these Ag-Gag legislation has now been introduced in Ontario, Alberta, Manitoba, and PEI. And these laws have generally taken on the same form of the agricultural fraud laws in the United States. So for the purposes of today's presentation, we will only be focusing on Ontario's legislation. Each province's laws are slightly different, so this information does not necessarily apply to jurisdictions outside of Ontario. For example, there are also several nuances within Ontario's laws for journalists to navigate specifically. And for the sake of time, this webinar will not really go into those details. However, if that information is of interest to you, please reach out to us and let us know, and we can speak with you directly. So in order to understand how to combat Ag-Gag laws, it's really important to understand how we got here and why they exist. While the research shows that public demand for transparency in the food system is growing, there are two main reasons for this when it comes to animal agriculture in Canada. The first is that animals are considered private property, which makes it very difficult for us to see what's happening behind closed doors of animal agricultural facilities. And the second is that there are no laws setting standards for animal welfare on farms and virtually no government oversight of these facilities. Generally, animal protection is governed by provincial and federal animal cruelty legislation, and these laws typically create exemptions for the standard farming practices, which are mostly defined by voluntary industry codes of practice. As a result, Canadians are largely kept in the dark about how animals are treated in the industrial livestock operation. So this is why undercover investigations started becoming more and more predominant in Canada in around 2012. For example, Mercy for Animals did many investigations into virtually every sector of the animal agriculture industry, including meat, dairy, egg sectors, and they partnered with CTV's W5 to air many of these undercover investigations. These investigations have revealed, time and time again, the appalling standard conditions on farms and in slaughterhouses across the country, and they have really shaken the animal agricultural industry by imposing high costs in the form of litigation, reputation, recalls, and lost sales. So in a seemingly direct response to this threat, the economic interests of the industry, governments across Canada have began introducing Ag-Gag laws like this one that we have here in Ontario. So what exactly is Ontario's Ag-Gag law and what does it do? Well, Ontario's Ag-Gag law is called the Security from Trespass and Protecting Food Safety Act, which was passed into law in June 2020, formerly known as Bill 152. The act makes it an offense to enter farms or slaughterhouses under false pretenses, essentially making it illegal for journalists, animal protection advocates, and others to get hired at a farm or slaughterhouse in order to document and publicly expose animal abuse or other unlawful activities. Expressed differently, the lawful intent and actions of the industry workers essentially must be to just do work, get paid, and keep quiet about the day-to-day operations. For reference, we have included the relevant sections of the Act on the slide. So the Act also targets peaceful protesters who stand on public property outside farms and slaughterhouses to bear witness to the suffering of animals in transport and document the conditions of animals on transport trucks. It does so by making it offense to interfere or interact with animals inside the trucks. So for example, it prohibits interference with vehicles transporting farm animals, and it makes it an offense to interact with farm animals without the consent of the owner or occupier. And one important thing to note here is that the provisions of the Act apply to contact with farm animals, whether the animal is dead or alive. This is because either way, they are still considered property, the industry's property. And lastly, the Act makes it an offense to create conditions for farm animals to escape what are called animal protection zones or transport vehicles. And we'll get into exactly what an animal protection zone is a little bit later in the presentation. So one of the most troubling aspects of the legislation is it places a reverse onus on the accused. So this means it is up to the person charged with an offense under the Act to prove that they obtain consent from the owner or occupier to engage in the conduct in question. So why is this problematic? Well, under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, everyone has the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Normally, the prosecution bears the burden of proving all aspects of an offense beyond a reasonable doubt, including the inapplicability of any defenses that are raised. However, when a reverse onus is in place, the accused must prove the relevant elements of what is called a balance of probabilities. So in other words, the court is determining which circumstances was more likely to have occurred than the other. This can result in cases where an accused might nevertheless be convicted, even though there is a reasonable doubt as to their guilt. Now I'll pass it back over to Krystal.
Thanks, Kira. So another particularly troubling aspect of the legislation is that it gives owners and occupiers of agricultural facilities really quite broad rights to question and arrest individuals without a warrant. And notably, unlike other citizens' arrest provisions in other pieces of legislation, a facility's owner or occupier does not need to have objectively reasonable and probable grounds for an arrest. Instead, they're only required to have a subjective or kind of personal belief that there are reasonable grounds for an arrest. So the arrest powers set out at Section 8 on the slide here can also be used in a seemingly limitless range of circumstances, including where an employer believes that an employee working at a facility may have made a false statement years ago on their resume or during their job interview. Section 8(1)A, that's in red text here of the Act, states that the facility's owner or occupier may request that the person provide their name and address. And subsection 8(4) prohibits the person from providing false or misleading information in response to such a request. And the consequences for committing any of the offenses under the Act can be quite substantial. For example, a first offense can result in a fine of up to $15,000, and subsequent offenses can result in fines up to $25,000. So quite high in terms of penalties. So where do these laws apply? Well, they generally apply in 3 places that are defined in the Act. The first is on farms, the second is animal processing facilities, and the third is animal protection zones, as Kira mentioned. So you might be wondering what exactly an animal protection zone is. It's a term that the Act uses, which essentially means an enclosure for farm animals within a farm animal processing facility or prescribed premises. The These zones may be marked with an orange sign like the one you see on the slide here, but the point we want to emphasize from this definition is that they don't have to be marked. So it can be very hard to tell where they start and where they end. Collectively, the three terms, farms, animal processing facilities, and animal protection zones, can really cover a wide range of areas where animals are kept, such as, for example, slaughterhouses, rodeo arenas, livestock auctions, fairs, and petting zoos. Now, these specific places are not listed in the law. There are just a few examples of the many places that could be interpreted as being included under the broad definitions of farm animal processing facility or animal protection zone in the Act. So when in doubt, obviously err on the side of caution. And I'll pass it back to Kira for the next part.
So we understand that these laws can be very overwhelming and difficult for activists to navigate. So next we will go into what you should do if you find yourself in trouble under these Ag-Gag laws for whatever reason. Next slide, please. So we'll remind you that if you are caught on the premises you are not supposed to be on without consent, the owner or occupier can request your name and address, request that you stop doing whatever conduct you're engaging in, request that you leave the premises, or conduct a citizen's arrest, which is essentially detaining you until the police show up. And what can the police do? Similarly, the police can arrest without a warrant if you are found trespassing or interfering or interacting with the animals in one of these restricted zones or on transport vehicles, in addition to all of the powers of the owners and occupiers previously mentioned. But unlike the owner and occupier, the police can go a step further and arrest you after you've already left the scene and you refuse to provide your information, or if they believe you've provided incorrect information. So as a case example, the first charge under these new laws occurred at Fearman's Slaughterhouse in Burlington, Ontario on September 2nd, 2021. So just a few days after the regulations of the law came into force. So approximately 20 activists were outside the slaughterhouse bearing witness to the pigs arriving on transport trucks. The activists were not interfering with the pigs or getting in the way of the trucks. However, unfortunately, an activist, Diane Smeal, who I believe is on this webinar today, was crossing the road on a green light and was still stopped by the police and given a ticket for $490 under these new laws for allegedly interfering with the truck carrying pigs to the slaughter. We understand that Diane is fighting this charge in court, but has yet to hear back an update from the court as to the status of the matter. So if you are engaging in conduct contrary to these laws, it is strongly advised that you do not resist the laws any further by refusing to cooperate with the owner or occupier or the police. So instead, you should provide the correct name and address if asked, cease any conduct in question and or leave the premises if asked, and do not resist the arrest, whether by citizen or police. Refusal to provide correct information or resisting the arrest could result in increased penalties and fines against you. Additionally, if you're giving an opportunity to simply leave the premises without having to provide your information or involving the police, you should take it before things escalate further. So in general, if you're planning to engage in any kind of animal activism, we strongly recommend that you know the contact information of a criminal lawyer and have this with you at all times in case of trouble. Secondly, you should ask to speak to your lawyer immediately upon arrest, or if you are arrested or obtained, you must be told that why you have been arrested or detained, and told immediately that you have the right to a lawyer and allowed to speak to that lawyer in private, a lawyer of your choice as soon as possible, if you ask to do so. So note that the police do not have to give you the opportunity to speak to the lawyer unless you specifically say that you want to. So definitely remember to assert this right. And finally, assert your right to silence. So do not answer any questions past providing your contact information without speaking to your lawyer. And even after speaking to your lawyer, the police, or before, the police may continue to ask you questions. And even if you say you do not want to answer, they can continue to ask and try and get under your skin. So you remember that you have the right to remain silent and that you should do so. So here we have a brief clip of someone effectively asserting their right to silence.
Incidents like this, that they become polarized, that they, and that's the thing is that I'm trying to tell you is that they see you as being that Palestinian. They see you as being that Palestinian with that huge, because that's the problem here, is that they see you walking in with this big backpack full of nails and walking into a mall and detonating that explosive. Unless I got all wrong and you're planning like 9/11 or something here. What is that for? You know what? If you ask who they were fighting for, they tell you. I understand the cause. And to a large degree, I find it to be a just cause. Is to at least acknowledge who you're deserving. I'm not even certain of that.
So as you can see, the police can use many different tactics to really just try and get any sort of reaction or word out of the accused. So it is important to stay silent as this individual did. Now I'll pass it back over to Krystal.
Thanks, Kira. So as animal advocates, we know that it can be really challenging to kind of navigate this new legal regime and figure out how you can continue to effectively and legally advocate for animals in light of it. So in this next part of the presentation, we try to provide you with some tips for doing so. Some possible advocating tactics we're going to cover include first, continuing to share information about animal agriculture in Canada. Second, working with individuals in other provinces. Third, changing the location of your protests to high traffic but animal-free areas. Fourth, building relationships and speaking to your local MPs and MPPs about animal issues. And finally, exploring passive activism strategies. So our first suggestion is to continue to share information about animal agriculture in Canada with your friends, family, and the public. In spite of Ag-Gag laws, or maybe because of them, it's really important that we continue to educate the public about the state of animal protection legislation in Ontario and Canada more broadly, and about current farming practices. This is the only way to bring awareness to the issues and advocate for positive change. So you can do this in any number of ways, including, for example, handing out leaflets, hosting information sessions, or posting on social media. You can really get as creative as you want. And even though it isn't directly relevant to the state of animal protection in Ontario, it can, in Ontario specifically, it can be incredibly helpful to continue to share undercover footage from farms and slaughterhouses in other provinces. It not only exposes people to the conditions in these facilities, but can really demonstrate why the public should be allowed to see inside them and why it's so important for us to repeal Ontario's Ag-Gag law. So as of right now, some variation of Ag-Gag laws exist in Ontario, Alberta, Quebec, Manitoba, and PEI. So our next suggestion is to work with activists in provinces where Ag-Gag laws do not exist. This could include sharing resources to aid in their protests. For example, sharing your digital posters, flyers, or information for others to use, or donating to their cause. Using word of mouth or social media to let others know about protests happening in other provinces. And you can really use this again as an opportunity to mention Ag-Gag laws in Ontario and why you can't participate in the same type of protest locally. And again, raising awareness of footage that people uncover in other provinces. Many of you may be aware of the footage of animal abuse obtained in BC at the end of 2021 from Cedar Valley Farms. For example, it's important that we continue to share these types of stories from across the country and make sure people in Ontario are aware of these issues. You could also consider traveling to participate in out-of-province protests, of course, when it is safe and legal to do so. Building connections with activists outside of Ontario may present you with opportunities to visit and participate in their activism. However, keep in mind that even if Ag-Gag laws do not exist or apply in that province, general trespass laws typically do. Our third suggestion is that you consider changing the location of your protests from outside farms or slaughterhouses or places where animals are kept to other high traffic but animal-free areas. The target audience for this kind of activism is typically the general public. So we can start to rethink how we can best reach this audience in light of Ontario's Ag-Gag legislation. Some suggestions of places where you could move protests include a public park, a beach, a farmer's market, outside of a mall, or outside of the Ontario Legislative Building. And one of the best ways to really affect change is to get political. So we highly recommend that you start building relationships with your MP and MPP. You can call, email, or write a letter to your local MPP and let them know your concerns and urge them to repeal Ontario's Ag-Gag legislation. The timing right now is particularly good with the upcoming elections, provincial elections in June. So we've included a link on this slide where you can find your MPP. And again, these slides will be posted on our website following the webinar. And while the proposed federal Ag-Gag legislation, formerly known as Bill C-205, did not pass through the legislative process, you may still consider reaching out to your MP to find out if they supported or opposed the bill. And you can use this as an opportunity to discuss your concerns with them about Ontario's Ag-Gag legislation and Ag-Gag legislation in other provinces, and start a conversation about other animal issues you're concerned about. If you're looking for some really great tips and tricks about how to get political and be effective, we really recommend you check out the videos in week 3 of the Animal Justice Academy, which is also linked on this slide. Finally, you can consider exploring and implementing passive activism strategies, for getting others to think about the treatment of animals on farms and change their diets. For example, you could cook a plant-based meal for omnivore friends or family, or put informational posters up around different neighborhoods to keep people informed about the state of animal agriculture and the state of Ag-Gag laws in Ontario as well. And with that, I'll pass it back to Kira.
Thanks, Krystal. So we know all of the we know all of this affects the way that you advocate, but the good news is that Ontario's Ag-Gag laws are being challenged in the courts by animal justice. So in 2021, Animal Justice filed a lawsuit challenging certain sections of the Ontario Security from Trespass and Protecting Food Safety Act for violating the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, most notably the rights to freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and peaceful assembly. Additionally, Jessica Scott Reed, who is a freelance journalist, and Louise Jorgensen, a volunteer at the Toronto Cow Save, are also parties to this lawsuit, as they are being personally affected by the law's implication. So to the best of our knowledge, the case will be heard in the divisional court later this year. It was supposed to be heard this spring, but due to the court delays as a result of the pandemic, it has been pushed back, but hopefully we are optimistic that it'll be heard this year. And if they win, Animal Justice is asking for the challenge sections of the law to be struck down as unconstitutional. In the United States, courts have struck these similar laws down, about a dozen of them, on the basis of the laws restricting or prohibiting whistleblowing activities on farms violating the First Amendment right to the freedom of speech. And they are urging Canadian courts to follow suit. So this would mean that the law would be of no force in effect, and advocacy activities could resume as they did prior to these laws existing. And it is also our understanding that Animal Justice plans to challenge the laws in the other jurisdictions as well, and they are simply starting the ball rolling with Ontario's laws. So part 6, summary and questions. So to summarize what we've been over this evening, don't be discouraged, continue advocating for what we believe in and what you believe in. Be smart and creative in your new approach to advocating. When in doubt, err on the side of caution when navigating these laws. And when in trouble, comply with the request, but ask to speak to your lawyer before providing any information beyond your name and address. And use Ag-Gag laws as an opportunity to raise awareness about conditions on the farms and why we need more transparency in the food system. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. We're a bit ahead of schedule, but before we jump into our question and answer session, I'd like to mention we will be sending out a short survey about the webinar via email for you to fill out for any feedback that we would really appreciate. You could take a few minutes to fill it out. I'm going to stop the recording at this point so that we can get to some